Eleanor Wharton had learned, over the course of 2 years, that the most efficient way to become invisible was to be useful, not useful in the way that mattered, not useful in the way a wife was useful, or a daughter. Or a woman with prospects and a future that belonged to her. Useful in the smaller, quieter sense. The kind of useful that kept her hands occupied and her eyes down and gave the people around her a reason to tolerate her presence without having to acknowledge it. This morning she was useful in the linen room. The linen room of her Aunt Marjorie's country house was located at the far end of the east corridor. Past the door that stuck in damp weather and the window that had not been properly latched since the autumn of 1809. It smelled of dried lavender and something older underneath the particular staleness of things that had been folded and set aside and not thought about for a very long time. Eleanor had been assigned the task of sorting through the household's older table linens, identifying those that could be salvaged and those that could not. That it was, like most of the tasks assigned to her here, work that no one else wanted to do. She had been at it since 7:30. The autumn light came through the single window in a thin, gray column, and she worked by it methodically, unfolding each piece, holding it to the light, assessing the damage. Some of the linens were merely discolored with age and could be bleached back to something serviceable. Others had been eaten through by moths, the fabric softened to a kind of delicate rot, the weave dissolving at the slightest pressure. These she set to one side. There was a certain satisfaction in the categorizing. She had found the clean logic of salvageable and unsalvageable. The clarity of a judgment that required no argument and admitted no appeal. She was examining a tablecloth that had once been very fine. She could tell from the weight of the linen and the faintness of an embroidered border at its edge. A pattern of laurel leaves that had mostly been consumed when she heard the voices from the kitchen corridor below. The linen room sat directly above the kitchen passage. Sound traveled upward through the old floorboards with an intimacy that the house's builders had almost certainly not intended. Heard she's been here 2 years now. 2 whole years. Well, what else would she do? No family will take her back after what happened. Eleanor did not move. She had learned, also, not to move. I heard the gentleman wasn't cruel about it. This was the younger kitchen maid. The one with the red hair. Only told her father the morning of the wedding. Very politely. I was told, politely. The cook's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 40 years watching other people's misfortunes validate her view of the world. He was polite because he had a new arrangement already in place. That's the only reason a man is ever polite about that sort of thing. He had what he needed and she was no longer it, but why didn't she say so? She never said anything in her own defense. A pause. The sound of something being set down on a stone surface, because what would be the point? The cook said. Say what she likes. She's still the woman who was left at the altar. That's the story. The story doesn't change just because she talks. Eleanor set the tablecloth down very carefully on the unsalvageable pile. The story doesn't change just because she talks. She had arrived at this same conclusion herself. Approximately 14 months ago, after the third attempt at explanation had produced nothing except a new version of the story in which she had been difficult, or demanding, or secretly in love with someone else. Each retelling adding some small new embellishment that made the original fact that he had simply left without cause that anyone would acknowledge more palatable to the people who preferred a reason. She had stopped explaining after that. She had folded the impulse away like a piece of cloth with a compromised weave, set it on the unsalvageable pile, and moved on. What remained was this. A room at the top of Aunt Marjorie's house, 3 meals a day taken either in the kitchen or in her room depending on whether there was company, and a series of tasks: the linen sorting, the household accounts, the mending. The reading aloud to Aunt Marjorie in the evenings when Marjorie's eyes were tired that kept her occupied and justified her continued presence here. She was 28 years old. She had stopped expecting anything to change. She finished the tablecloth assessment in silence. When she was done, the salvageable pile contained 11 pieces. The unsalvageable pile contained 17. She recorded both numbers in the small household ledger she had been given for the purpose, her handwriting precise and even, and went downstairs to find Aunt Marjorie. Aunt Marjorie was in the front parlor. Engaged in the specific variety of morning inactivity that she referred to as correspondence and which consisted primarily of reading other people's letters and composing responses in her head that she would not write for several days. She looked up when Eleanor came in. And Eleanor saw immediately from the quality of her aunt's expression a compound of inconvenience and calculating interest that something had happened. "There is a letter for you," Aunt Marjorie said. Eleanor could not recall the last time she had received a letter. "For me? Addressed to you specifically?" Marjorie held it out with 2 fingers, as though its implications might be contagious. "From the north. From the Duke of Crest Hollow." Eleanor took it. The envelope was heavy paper. The seal dark wax impressed with a crest she did not recognize. Her name was written on the front in a hand that was spare and exact, with no flourish and no waste. "Miss Eleanor Wharton. Do you know him?" Aunt Marjorie asked, watching her with the focused attention of a woman who had spent a lifetime monitoring doorways for opportunity. No. Eleanor turned the letter over. "I don't believe I've ever met him." "The Duke of Crest Hollow," Marjorie repeated, as though the name itself required additional weight. "His family has held the Northern Territories for 3 centuries. They say he oversees every contract, every tenancy agreement, every dispute on his lands personally. They call him the Iron Duke." She paused. "They also say he has not smiled in public since he inherited the title 8 years ago, but I suppose that is neither here nor there." Eleanor had heard the name 2 months ago. At the one dinner party she had attended since her arrival, a subdued affair at the home of a neighboring family. Attended primarily by people too elderly or too settled to require entertainment, she had been seated near a cluster of women who had discussed him at length. The Iron Duke of Crest Hollow, who had sent his own solicitor to padlock a tenant's granary over 2 seasons of missed rent, who kept a public register of every broken agreement in his territory, updated annually, posted at the gates of his estate for the entire county to read, who had not married, despite being a 1030. Despite the title and the lands and the considerable pressure of succession. "What does he want?" Aunt Marjorie asked. Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "It was very short. 2 sentences and a signature. "I will call upon the household at Thornfield on Wednesday next, if that date is convenient, to discuss a proposal I believe may be of mutual benefit. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with Miss Wharton directly." Crest Hollow. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the parlor window, where the late October garden had gone brown and still. "He wishes to call on Wednesday," she said. "He says he has a proposal." Aunt Marjorie's intake of breath was almost inaudible. "Almost. A proposal," she repeated. She stopped herself. Eleanor could see her reassembling her expression into something more composed. "Well, that is unexpected." It was, Eleanor thought. It was entirely unexpected. She looked again at the 2 spare sentences, at the signature with its absence of any title, any flourish. Just the name, as though it were a fact being entered into a ledger. She did not know what he wanted. She did not know how he knew her name, or what he could possibly have concluded about her from whatever information had reached him. She knew only what everyone knew. That he was a man who valued one thing above all others. A man who had built his entire world around the enforcement of promises kept, and that he had written to the one person in the county whose primary distinction, for the past 2 years, had been as the subject of a promise broken. She set the letter on the side table next to Aunt Marjorie's correspondence pile, carefully, at a right angle to the table's edge. "I suppose," she said, "we should prepare the front parlor." He arrived on Wednesday at 11 o'clock precisely. Eleanor knew the exact time because she had been watching the parlor clock with the detached attention of someone who had run out of other things to do with their hands. Aunt Marjorie had spent the preceding days in a state of barely suppressed agitation, oscillating between the conviction that this was a misunderstanding of some kind and the conviction that it was not, and had changed her dress twice before settling on a gray silk that she felt communicated the appropriate combination of respectability and welcome. Eleanor had worn the same dress she always wore to receive visitors. It was dark blue wool, well made, several years old. and had no opinions about the occasion. The Duke of Cresthollow was announced by the butler with a formality that suggested even the servants understood something unusual was happening, that he was taller than she had expected. She was not sure why she had formed an expectation, perhaps because men cribbed primarily in terms of their severity tended, in her experience, to be smaller than their reputations. As though the energy required to maintain such a reputation left insufficient resources for physical stature. The Duke did not have this problem. He filled the doorway in a way that was not aggressive but simply factual. And when he entered the room, he brought with him a quality of stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of a man standing still. It was the stillness of something that had decided, at some prior point, to be exactly what it was, and had not reconsidered since that he was not what one would call handsome in the easy, conventional sense. His face was angular and composed, the features arranged with a precision that suggested function over ornament. His hair was dark. His eyes a gray that she would later think of as the color of the northern sky before a storm, not threatening, exactly, but entirely indifferent to the preferences of anyone looking at it. He looked at Aunt Marjorie first, because she was the elder woman in the room, and inclined his head. "Mrs. Aldworth. Thank you for receiving me." Then he looked at Eleanor. It was not an assessment in the way she had grown accustomed to being assessed, that particular sliding inventory that moved from her face to her figure to whatever could be inferred about her situation, and arrived, generally, at the same conclusion. This was something else. It was the look of a man examining a document he had already decided was relevant and was now confirming the details. "Miss Wharton," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Aunt Marjorie, who had apparently decided that her role in this proceeding was to be present but not disruptive, arranged herself on the settee with an expression of concentrated neutrality and said nothing. The Duke sat in the chair across from Eleanor without waiting to be invited, not rudely, but with the matter-of-fact economy of a man who did not consider the formality necessary. He placed his hat on the side table at a precise angle. He did not look around the room. He looked at her. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," he said. "I have found, in my experience, that pleasantries generally obscure the thing being said rather than improve it. That I have found the same." Eleanor said, something in his expression shifted by a degree too small to name. He continued, "That I am in need of a duchess. This is not a new requirement, it has existed for some years, but I have not previously encountered a candidate I considered suitable for the specific nature of the position." He paused. "I should be direct about what I mean by suitable. I do not require a woman of particular beauty, social brilliance, or aristocratic connection. I require a woman of reliable judgment, practical capability, and above all demonstrable integrity." Eleanor waited. "I became aware of your situation through a mutual acquaintance," he said. "I investigated further. What I found was this: 2 years ago, you were subject to a serious breach of promise. Your intended withdrew from a binding agreement on the morning of your wedding, without cause that he has ever publicly acknowledged. You have not, in the 2 years since, made any false counterclaim, spread any retaliatory account, or attempted to misrepresent the circumstances to improve your position." He looked at her steadily. "In a situation where most people would have considered embellishment justified, you told the truth, received no benefit from doing so, and continued to tell it." The parlor clock ticked. "I find that remarkable," the Duke said. "In my experience, it is rare," Eleanor said, carefully. "I'm not sure whether you are complimenting me or describing me." "Both," he said. "They are the same thing." In this instance, she looked at him. He looked back, with that gray, weatherless patience. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "It was not quite a question that I am," he said. "I recognize this is not a conventional proposal. I am not offering romance, or affection, or the pretense of either. What I am offering is a household to manage, a position of genuine authority and responsibility, financial security. And my word, which I do not give lightly and have never broken, that you will be treated with consistent respect." He paused. "What I am asking in return is that you manage my household with the same integrity you have demonstrated in considerably less favorable circumstances. I am asking you to be CTLY what you already are. Eleanor became aware that Aunt Marjorie had stopped breathing. She herself felt something strange, not the warm, disorienting sensation she had once associated with the word proposal. The feeling of being chosen for reasons that had something to do with who she was as a person. This was colder than that. More precise. He was not choosing her despite her history. He was choosing her because of it. He had looked at the worst 2 years of her life and seen something she had not, though. Ought to look for herself, she was, the Duke of Cresthollow was telling her, not a woman with a ruined past. She was a woman with a verified record. Why, she said, after a moment, did you come yourself? You might have sent a solicitor. A solicitor cannot evaluate a person. He said. I can. And have you evaluated me? Yes. And your conclusion? He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes. That you are precisely what I said you were. And that most people in your position would have become something diminished by now. And you have not. A brief pause. I find that I respect it considerably. Eleanor looked at the carpet. Then at the window. Then at him. She thought about the linen room. She thought about the sound of the cook's voice through the floorboards. The story doesn't change just because she talks. She thought about the 14 months of silence that had followed her decision to stop talking, and all the silence that had preceded it, and the silence waiting for her if she remained here, organized, correct, invisible. Indefinitely. He was not offering her love. He was offering her a position. A role with actual authority. A house that would be hers to manage and not merely to occupy. He was offering her, she realized with a clarity that was almost physical. The one thing she had not let herself want because she had been too busy surviving, a place where she would be taken seriously. That I accept, she said. Aunt Marjorie made a sound that was not quite a word. The Duke nodded once, as though a transaction had been confirmed. Which she supposed it had. I will have my solicitor contact you regarding the settlements, he said. They are, I believe, more than fair. My estate in Yorkshire Cresthollow Castle will be your home. I would suggest we proceed with the arrangements as efficiently as possible. If that is agreeable to you. It is, she said. He rose, retrieved his hat from the side table. He looked at her once more, and she had the impression, not quite warm, not quite cold, something suspended between the two, that he had found what he came to find. Miss Wharton, he said, Your Grace. She said. He left. The front door closed. Aunt Marjorie turned to Eleanor with an expression that had entirely abandoned its neutrality. Eleanor, she said. What have you done? Eleanor looked at the chair where the Duke had sat. He had left it at exactly the angle at which he had found it. I believe, she said, I've accepted a proposal. They were married 6 weeks later in a small church in the village. On a morning when the frost was heavy enough to silver the churchyard grass and the sky was the particular white of a day that has not yet decided what it intends to do, the ceremony was short. The Duke spoke his vows in the same tone he might have used to confirm the terms of a contract, not Carell. Esley, but with a deliberate precision that suggested each word was being placed exactly where he intended it. Eleanor spoke hers in the same way. Aunt Marjorie wept with an enthusiasm that Eleanor privately felt was disproportionate. Given that she had spent the intervening 6 weeks oscillating between congratulation and dire warning. Afterward, they stepped into the Duke's carriage, which was large and black and very clean, and the door closed behind them. And Eleanor looked out the window as the familiar lanes of the village moved past and gave way to open country. She was now the Duchess of Cresthollow. The Duke sat across from her with the hat on his knee and looked out his own window. He did not speak for several miles. Are you cold? He said. Eventually. No, she said. He nodded and returned to his window. They traveled north for 3 days. Cresthollow Castle appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day. At the end of a private road that wound through 2 miles of moorland before the land rose to a ridge and the castle came into view all at once, without warning. As though it had been waiting there for centuries and had simply decided the moment had arrived. It was not beautiful in the way of houses built to impress. It was beautiful in the way of things that have stood long enough to become part of the landscape. The dark stone the same color as the moorland. And the earth, the towers rising without ornament against the wide northern sky, the whole structure possessing a kind of settled gravity that suggested it had never needed to announce itself to anyone. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "It's very serious," she said. The Duke, who had been watching her face rather than the castle, said, "Yes, I mean that as a compliment. I know," he said. The carriage drew up to the entrance and the doors opened and the staff were assembled on the steps in two precise lines, uniformed, correct. Their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of people who have been told something significant is happening and are waiting to determine what they think about it. The butler was a tall man of perhaps 60 with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime managing the relationship between order and contingency. He bowed to the Duke and then, with a slight but perceptible recalibration, to Eleanor. "Your Grace," he said. "Welcome home. And welcome to Crest Hollow, Your Grace," he added, to Eleanor. "Thank you, Mr. Alderton." Eleanor said, "I'm glad to be here." She meant it. She had not been sure, until she said it, that she would mean it. The housekeeper was a woman of middle age with efficient eyes and a manner that conveyed, without discourtesy, that she was reserving judgment. Her name was Mrs. Peel. She showed Eleanor to the Duchess' apartments in the East Wing, 2 rooms that had been unoccupied for some years and still carried the particular silence of disuse. The furniture arranged with a formality that felt more like storage than habitation. "His Grace said you might wish to make changes," Mrs. Peel said, her tone neutral on the question of whether this would be welcome. Eleanor looked around the rooms. The windows faced east, over the moorland. In the morning, she thought, the light would come in across the heather. "I would like," she said, "to start with the windows. They haven't been opened in some time." Mrs. Peel blinked. Then she moved to the nearest window and released the latch. Cold northern air came in, smelling of frost and distance and something alive. It moved through the room like a question. Eleanor breathed it in. That evening, before dinner, she walked through the part of the castle she had been shown, and then through the part she had not been shown, following corridors and opening doors with a methodical curiosity that had nothing aggressive in it. She was learning the shape of things. She had always learned best by moving through spaces, by understanding where the rooms were in relation to each other, where the light came from, where the quiet collected. She found the records room on the ground floor of the north wing, a large, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves, every shelf dense with ledgers and bundled documents and folded correspondence. A filing system that appeared, from initial inspection, to have been organized on the principle that proximity in time was more important than any other kind of relationship. 30 years of estate records, tenancy agreements, correspondence with solicitors, contractual disputes, all of it present. All of it inaccessible without an intimate knowledge of where any particular thing had been placed. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then she found a lamp, carried it to the central table, sat down, and opened the nearest ledger. She was still there 2 hours later when the Duke appeared in the doorway. That he did not say anything immediately. He looked at her, at the open ledger, at the lamp, at the careful stack of documents she had already begun to sort into related groups. "Dinner was at 7, he said. Eleanor looked up. "I apologize. I lost track of the time." That he looked at the table again. "What are you doing?" "Beginning to understand how this room is organized," she said. "Or rather, how it is not organized." She paused. "I hope you don't object." That he was quiet for a moment. "No one has been in this room with any purpose in several years," he said. It was not an objection. It was something closer to an observation, said to himself as much as to her. Then it was waiting. Eleanor said that he looked at her. The lamp threw uneven light across the shelves, and in it his face was less composed than it had been in Aunt Marjorie's parlor. Not softer, exactly, but less finished. She could see, for the first time, that the control he carried was something he maintained rather than something he simply possessed. "Come to dinner," he said. She closed the ledger, set it precisely at the edge of the table, and followed him out. Outside the records room, nailed to the wall at the entrance to the north wing, was a notice she had not seen on her way in. It was a large sheet of paper, carefully lettered, headed, "Register of Parties in Breach of Agreement with the Crest Hollow Estate." Below it were names. Dozens of them. Each followed by a date and a brief description. Thomas Hartley. Farmer. Lease agreement, September 1811. Defaulted on third quarter rent without notice, George and Robert Fenwick, wool merchants. Supply contract. April 1809. Delivered inferior grade against contracted specification. The list went on for the full length of the page and onto a second page pinned below it. Some of the entries were dated nearly 20 years ago. Eleanor read it in the lamplight as the Duke waited at the end of the corridor. Then she turned and walked toward him, and said nothing about it, because she was still thinking about what it meant, this careful, public accounting of every broken promise. Maintained and updated and displayed at the entrance to the room where all the estate's contracts were kept. She thought about it through dinner, which was formal and quiet and served by footmen who moved with a precision that matched the castle's general atmosphere of controlled exactitude. The Duke asked her whether her rooms were satisfactory. She said they were. He told her the estate comprised some 12,000 acres of moorland and agricultural land, with a village of approximately 300 tenants. She said she would like to understand the estate accounts when she had the opportunity to review them. He looked at her with an attention that was, she thought, slightly more than she had expected. She did not ask about the list, but as she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the wind move across the moors outside her east-facing window, she thought, a man who has kept that list for 20 years is not merely organized. He is afraid of something. And whatever it is the thing that built this castle's silence around it. She began on a Thursday. There was no particular reason for Thursday except that Wednesday had been consumed by the business of arrival, learning where things were, understanding the rhythms of the household, finding the particular door in the east corridor that stuck and required lifting the handle slightly before it would open. By Thursday she had enough of a map in her head to begin moving through it with purpose. She started in the records room. She had lain awake 2 nights thinking about it, which was 2 nights longer than she generally spent thinking about organizational problems. The issue was not simply disorder. Disorder could be addressed by sorting. The deeper problem was that the room had no underlying logic. Documents had been filed by arrival date, which meant that a tenancy agreement from 1798 and its renewal from 1815 and the dispute correspondence from 1816 were on 3 separate shelves on 3 separate walls with no indication of their relationship. Anyone wishing to understand the history of a particular property or a particular tenant would have to already know what they were looking for and approximately when it had occurred that it was, she thought, a system designed by someone who held all the information in his own head and therefore did not need the room to communicate anything. She requisitioned, through Mrs. Peel, a supply of paper, ink, and approximately 40 lengths of ribbon in 3 colors. Mrs. Peel received this request with the expression of someone who had been asked to explain the habits of a new and unfamiliar animal to the rest of the household, and said she would see what could be found. Eleanor began by reading. She read for 4 days. She read tenancy agreements and lease renewals and correspondence with solicitors in York and London and 2 in Edinburgh. She read the records of disputes. There were more than she expected. Meticulously documented, each one containing not just the resolution but a full account of the proceedings, the evidence presented, the judgment rendered. She read the contracts with wool merchants and grain factors and the company that supplied coal to the castle. All of them more detailed than she had encountered in any household she had previously managed, every contingency specified, every obligation defined to the point where ambiguity had been, as far as possible, removed entirely. She began to understand what she was looking at. This was not simply an estate's business records. It was an argument. A sustained 20-year argument made in ink and paper against the proposition that agreements could be dissolved by convenience or circumstance. Every document said, in its particular way, this was promised, this is what was delivered. Here is the evidence. The filing chaos was incidental, an accretion of volume over time, but the intention underneath it was rigorous and consistent and, she was beginning to think, personal in a way that business records were not usually personal. On the 5th day, she started building the index. She worked in the mornings, while the light was good, and in the evenings after dinner, when the Duke retired to his study and the castle settled into its nighttime quiet. She developed a color system: blue ribbon for property documents, red for commercial contracts, green for dispute correspondence, and began transferring her notes into a master ledger that cross-referenced by name, by property, and by date. She did not ask permission. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply did it, quietly. In the room that had been waiting for someone to give it a purpose. On the 8th day, the Duke came in. She heard him before she saw him. His footstep was distinctive, unhurried. Each step placed with the same deliberate precision that characterized everything else about him. She did not look up from the document she was transcribing. "You have been in here every day," he said. "Yes," she said. That he moved into the room. She heard him stop somewhere to her left. And she had the impression he was looking at the shelves rather than at her. "You've reorganized the upper shelves, the first phase." "Yes. The property documents are in order now. Cross-referenced by parcel." She set down her pen and indicated the master ledger at her right. "I've built an index. Anyone wishing to locate records for a specific property or tenant can find them directly rather than by date of filing." She paused. "I can walk you through it, if you'd like." That he came to the table. He stood beside her and looked at the ledger she had opened, and she was briefly aware of his proximity, the scent of cold air and wool and something faint that might have been wood smoke, before she directed her attention back to the page. "This notation," he said, pointing to a symbol in the margin. "A cross-reference marker. If a property appears in both a tenancy agreement and a subsequent dispute record, both entries carry the same marker so they can be located together." She turned to the index at the front of the ledger. "Here. The symbols are listed with their corresponding shelf and section numbers." That he was quiet for a moment, reading. "This took you 8 days. He said. "The first phase. The commercial contracts are not yet indexed. That will take another week, possibly 10 days." That he looked at her. She met the look without difficulty. She found, stopped finding his directness unsettling somewhere around the 3rd day. It was, in its way, restful. He looked at her because he was thinking about her, and when he was not thinking about her he looked elsewhere. "There was no performance in it. That I didn't ask you to do this," he said. "And oh," she agreed. "Why did you?" she considered. "Because it needed doing, and I could do it." And because she stopped. "Because," he said, waiting, "because I wanted to understand how this place works," she said. "Not the household. The whole thing, the estate, the agreements, the way decisions are made. I can't manage something I don't understand." She looked at the shelves. "And I found, when I started reading, that I wanted to understand it. Not just for practical reasons." That he was still looking at her. What other reasons? That it was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "Whoever built this system," she said, "cared about it very much. You can tell, from the documents, that every contract was reviewed personally. Every dispute record has annotations in the same hand, corrections, additions. Sometimes a single word underlined that changes the entire emphasis of a sentence." She paused. "I find that I want to understand what that person was trying to do." The silence that followed was different from his ordinary silences. It had a quality of attention that she had not encountered in him before. "Leave it on my desk when it's finished," he said at last. "The index." "Of course," she said. He left. She picked up her pen. 3 days later, when she placed the completed first phase index on his desk, she came back to her rooms to find a small package on her writing table, a new set of indexing nibs, the kind used for fine margin notation. Better than anything available in the nearest village. There was no note. She put them in the pen tray and sat down and looked at them for a moment. Then she picked one up and tested it on the edge of a piece of paper, and found it was exactly the weight she would have chosen herself. The incident happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Eleanor had completed the second phase of the index and begun, at the Duke's request, reviewing the commercial contract renewals for the coming year. She was in the records room when she heard the rise of voices in the Great Hall, which was unusual, because the Great Hall did not usually produce voices at that pitch. She would not have gone to look, except that one of the voices was the Duke's, and she had not heard that particular quality in it before. It was not anger, exactly. It was something that sat underneath anger. In a register that anger usually covered, she set down the contract she was reading and went to the hall. A young man was standing near the entrance, hat in hand. His posture the uncomfortable combination of determination and deference that suggested he had rehearsed this visit several times. He was perhaps 20, with the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors and a coat that had been carefully brushed for the occasion. Beside him, maintaining the careful neutrality of a man who has been placed in an impossible position, stood Mr. Alderton. The Duke stood in the center of the hall. He was very still. My father's name, the young man was saying, with the careful enunciation of someone trying to remain composed, was wrongly entered on the register. He did not default willingly. He came to the estate office 3 times to explain the circumstances. And 3 times he was turned away without. I am aware of what the register says. The Duke's voice was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor had been in his company long enough now to understand that his voice became quieter, not louder, when something was happening that he found. She could not identify the right word. Threatening was not quite it. Neither was upsetting. It was something more specific than either. A particular kind of threat to a particular kind of order, Your Grace. If someone would only look at the original agreement, the clause regarding harvest failure clearly states, "Leave." The Duke said, not unkindly. Not loudly. With a finality that was worse than either, the young man looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had known this might happen and had come anyway, which Eleanor thought, privately, required considerable nerve. Then he put his hat back on and walked out. Mr. Alderton closed the door behind him. The Duke stood in the hall for a moment after the door closed. His back was to Eleanor. She could see the set of his shoulders, that rigid architectural control, and underneath it something that was held too tightly to be called composure. He turned. He saw her. Something moved briefly across his expression, not embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. The slight alteration of a man who had been observed in a moment he would not have chosen to be observed. He walked past her without speaking. Eleanor returned to the records room. She sat at the table for a long time without picking up her pen. The afternoon light moved across the shelves. She thought about the young man's hands and his carefully brushed coat and the 3 times his father had come to explain and been turned away. After a while she rose and went to the section of the shelf she had not yet reached in the indexing the oldest documents from the first decade of the Duke's tenure and before. She was not looking for anything specific. She was following a thread. She found it on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, a bundle of correspondence tied with plain string, no ribbon yet. Not yet indexed. The bundle was thicker than the ones around it. She carried it to the table. Most of it was ordinary lease renewals, a survey report, letters about a disputed boundary with an adjacent property. Then, near the bottom of the bundle, she found a document that was different. It was older than the others, the paper slightly yellowed, the ink faded to brown at the edges. It was a letter, rather than a formal document. And it was addressed not to the estate but to the Duke's father. She did not read it. She read only the first line: I write to inform you that I have been advised the agreement of the 14th is no longer to be honored, and the signature at the bottom, and the date, 1798. 27 years ago. When the current Duke would have been a boy of perhaps 11 or 12. She put it back where she had found it. On the front of the bundle, in the Duke's hand that compressed, precise handwriting she had been reading for 3 weeks, were 4 words: these are not to be refiled. She stared at the words for a moment. They were not addressed to anyone. They were not instructions to a secretary or a housekeeper. They were a reminder to himself, she thought, or an injunction. A border drawn around something that had not been processed so much as contained. She tied the bundle back with its string and replaced it on the shelf exactly where she had found it. That night at dinner the Duke was more than usually silent, if such a thing were possible. And she did not break it. They ate in the smaller dining room that she had requested they use after the first week, because the formal dining room seated 40 and produced an echo during conversation. In the smaller room the fire was closer and the table was round, and the silence was a different quality, less like a void and more like weather. After the plates were cleared he said, without looking at her. The young man this morning. His father is on the register that I know, she said that he turned his wine glass a quarter turn. The register is accurate that I am sure it is, she said, another quarter turn. His father was given every opportunity to make his case at the time of the dispute that I believe you. She said that he looked at her then. She met his eyes and held them, not challenging, simply present, and something in his expression that had been held very tightly loosened by the smallest degree that he said nothing else about it. But she noticed, the following morning, that the young man's father's file had been pulled from the shelf and placed on the corner of the Duke's desk. She did not mention that she noticed, but she thought. The ice is there for a reason. And the reason is older than the register. The annual gathering of the northern landowners was held in the second week of December, at Ashford Hall, which belonged to a baronet named Sir Edmund Raleigh and was large enough to accommodate the county's ambitions without straining its architecture. Eleanor had attended one such gathering before, years ago, when her father was still alive and the family still had a position that required maintaining. She remembered it as a particular variety of social performance, the careful calibration of deference and assertion, the way alliances were signaled through proximity and conversation topics. The whole intricate machinery of a community that conducted most of its actual business in rooms that were ostensibly being used for entertainment. She had not expected to find it altered. What she had not anticipated was how differently she would experience it from her new position standing at Th. E. Duke's side rather than against the wall, wearing a gown that had been made for her rather than refitted from something older, introduced not as Miss Wharton, the niece of Mrs. Aldworth, but as the Duchess of Cresthollow. The room responded to the Duke the way rooms always responded to him, a slight adjustment, a reorientation, conversations pausing and resuming on slightly different trajectories. He moved through it with his characteristic stillness, speaking when spoken to, initiating nothing, his attention comprehensive and his expression revealing exactly as much as he chose to reveal, which was very little. Eleanor stayed close without being attached, which seemed to be what he expected and what she found she preferred. She had her own conversations with the wives of landowners, with a sharp-eyed woman who managed her late husband's estate and wanted to discuss drainage contracts, with the vicar of a neighboring parish who had opinions about the new road being laid through the eastern edge of the Cresthollow territory. She collected information and gave away little, which was a habit she had developed over 2 years of existing in other people's households and had not yet unlearned. Though she was beginning to think it might be worth keeping, she did not see him until she had been in the room for nearly an hour. That he was standing near the fireplace at the far end of the room, holding a glass of wine he had not touched, wearing the expression of a man who was very pleased with himself and saw no reason to conceal it. He was perhaps 30. With the kind of face that had been attractive once and was now beginning to show what it was made of. His name was Charles Welford. She knew this because she had spent 2 years in a county where his name was spoken with a particular frequency, sometimes in sympathy, sometimes in admiration, always in a way that oriented the story around him rather than around her. He had not seen her yet. She had a few seconds, therefore, in which to make a decision. And she found with a clarity that surprised her that the decision had already been made. She was not going to retreat. She was not going to find the nearest corridor and spend the remainder of the evening invisible. She was the Duchess of Cresthollow. She was here because she had been invited as the Duke's wife, and she was going to stand in this room for as long as the occasion required. She turned back to her conversation with the estate manager. She heard him before she saw him again, that particular tone of voice, sociable and effortless, moving through the room. Then he was in her field of vision, and a moment later he had stopped. Mrs. Forgive me. He smiled. The smile had been practiced. I was told you'd married. I must offer my congratulations. It seems things have worked out rather well for you. All considered, the estate manager had gone still in the way of someone who recognizes that they have walked into a situation they did not intend to enter. All considered. 2 words doing the work of a paragraph. All considered, given that you were left, given that you were damaged goods. Given that someone has apparently been charitable enough to take you on. You should be grateful. You are lucky. Things have worked out well for someone in your position. Eleanor looked at him. She thought of 2 years of kitchen conversations heard through floorboards. She thought of 17 UNS. Salvageable tablecloths. She thought of the careful, deliberate voice she had used to stop herself from answering back, the energy it had cost her. The slow erosion of standing in a room full of people who had decided what you were and would not be inconvenienced by contrary evidence. She was about to speak when she heard the Duke's footstep that he appeared at her left, close enough that she was aware of the solidity of him. And he looked at Charles Welford with the grey, weatherless patience that she had come to understand meant he had already arrived at a conclusion and was waiting for the other party to catch up. "Welford," he said. Not a greeting. An identification. Welford turned. Something in his expression shifted when he registered who he was looking at, a slight recalibration. The automatic adjustment of a man who has just understood that the social mathematics of a situation are different than he assumed. "Your Grace. I heard what you were just doing," the Duke said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. But Eleanor had been living in the same castle as this voice for 2 months and she had learned to distinguish its registers. And this one had a quality she had not heard directed outward before. It was the same quality she had heard in the great hall when the young man came to plead his father's case, except that then it had been turned inward. Held against something. Now it was directed with complete intention at Charles Welford, and it was not restrained at all. "My wife," the Duke said, was asked an impertinent question disguised as a compliment. "I'd like to address the premise of it." He did not raise his voice. He did not look away from Welford. The room, Eleanor became aware, had developed a particular quality of attention, the kind that comes when people who have been pretending to have other conversations have, in fact, stopped having them. You withdrew from a binding agreement. You did so without cause, without notice of sufficient duration. And without any public acknowledgement of your own conduct in the matter. My wife has not, in the 2 years since, made a single false claim, retaliatory statement, or misrepresentation of the circumstances. Not one. The fire crackled. Somewhere to the left. A glass was set down on a table. I keep a register of broken agreements. The Duke continued. I expect you know this. I maintain it because I believe that a community which does not account for the cost of broken promises eventually loses its ability to rely on any promise at all. He looked at Welford with the same expression he used to review a contract. Thorough. Unimpressed, complete. Your name is not on it. I made a decision, some time ago, that it should not be. I believed that the situation had caused sufficient damage without the addition of public record. A pause. Brief and precise. I am reviewing that decision. Charles Welford had the look of a man who had attended a great many social events and had never before been spoken to in public in a way he could not easily answer. His mouth opened and closed. The practiced smile was entirely gone. I think, the Duke said, with a finality that closed the topic rather than invited further discussion. You were about to find someone else to speak to. Welford left. He did it with as much dignity as the situation permitted, which was not very much. The estate manager, Eleanor noticed from the corner of her eye, had developed a sudden and intense interest in the middle distance. Around the room. Conversations had resumed, but at a slightly different pitch. The elevated frequency of people processing something they would be discussing for some weeks. The Duke turned to Eleanor. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He did not say, "I hope that was acceptable." He looked at her with that direct, assessing attention, and she looked back, and what passed between them was not a sentiment but a recognition, a simple, clean acknowledgement that something had just happened and they both understood what it was. The drainage contract. He said. I noticed you were speaking to Mrs. Holt. She's been trying to negotiate favorable terms with the county surveyor for 3 years. If you want, I can tell you what he responds to. Eleanor let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but had something of the same quality. Yes. She said. I'd like that. They moved back into the room together. She found him in the records room at 10:30. This was not, by now, particularly unusual. In the 6 weeks since she had completed the index. The records room had become a kind of shared territory. She worked there in the mornings and some evenings, and he had taken to appearing at irregular hours, reviewing documents, making annotations in the margins of contracts that she would find the following morning and read with the attention she brought to everything he wrote. They had developed, without discussing it, a system of coexistence in the space. She kept to the central table. He kept to the desk in the far corner. And the silence between them had long since ceased to be the silence of strangers. Tonight was different. She had come down for a document. She had forgotten a lease renewal she wanted to review in the morning and had found the lamp already lit and the Duke standing at the far window with a glass in his hand. Not at his desk. At the window, looking out at the moor in the dark. Which was a thing he did not usually do in rooms that were not his study. That he had been drinking. Not much. The glass was nearly full, but he was holding it in a way that suggested he had poured it for the sake of having something to hold, not for the sake of drinking it. That I thought you'd gone up. She said that I came to look at something, he said. He did not turn from the window. I have been meaning to. For some time. Eleanor set her lamp on the table and looked at him. She waited. After a moment he turned. He looked at her with an expression that was not his usual composed attention. It was the same expression she had seen, briefly, on the day the young man came to plead his father's case. Except that then it had been shuttered almost immediately, and now it was not. The bundle on the third shelf, he said. The one I've marked that I found it. She said. I didn't read it. I replaced it exactly as it was. Something in his face shifted. A small release of something that had been held in readiness against a possibility that had not occurred. I know, he said. I checked. She did not react to this. She understood it. That he set the glass down on the window ledge and crossed to the shelves. He found the bundle without looking. He knew the room as a body knows a familiar room in the dark and brought it to the table. He untied the string with the same deliberate, careful movements he brought to everything, and set the papers out, and looked at them for a long moment. Then he began. His father had been a man widely respected not for warmth, but for the solidity that was the defining characteristic of the Crest Hollow title going back 3 generations. He had managed the estate with what everyone agreed was considerable skill, growing the territory and the associated income through a combination of good judgment and advantageous agreements. He had been, on the evidence available to the outside world, an honorable man. When the Duke was 11 years old, a wool merchant named Barlow had come to the estate with a proposal for a long-term supply agreement. The terms were discussed over several months and eventually finalized in an oral agreement, documented in correspondence, of the kind that had served as binding contract in the region for generations. Barlow had committed to a significant investment based on the agreement. He had bought additional fleeces, engaged extra workers, expanded his processing capacity. 6 months later, the Duke's father had received a better offer from a larger commercial house in Leeds. He had taken it. He had not told Barlow directly. He had instructed the estate solicitor to send a letter informing Barlow that the estate had reviewed its commercial arrangements and would be pursuing other options. By the time Barlow received the letter, he had already overextended himself on the basis of the agreement. Barlow had come to the estate. He had been received politely and informed, by the solicitor, that oral agreements of the kind they had reached were not strictly enforceable and that the estate was not in a legal position to be held to them. This was technically correct. It was not a defense that addressed the central fact of what had been done. Barlow had lost his business within the year. That I was 12 when it happened, the Duke said. His voice was level. The way surfaces are level when something has been worked on them for a long time. I knew about it because I used to sit in on my father's business meetings. He allowed it. He said a duke should learn early how agreements work. He was looking at the papers on the table rather than at Eleanor. I remember the meeting when he decided to take the Leeds offer. I remember his face. There was no difficulty in it. He looked at one number and then at another number, and the second number was larger, and that was the only consideration. Eleanor did not speak. That I asked him, afterward. I was 12. And I asked him what would happen to Barlow. He told me that in commerce, all parties understood the inherent uncertainty of informal arrangements. And that Barlow had taken a risk and the risk had not resolved in his favor. The Duke's jaw tightened by a degree. He said this was the nature of business and that I would understand when I was older. That he picked up one of the documents and set it down again without reading it. Barlow died in 1801. 3 years after the agreement was broken. His son told me, when I first took the title, that his father had worked himself into illness trying to recover the business and had not succeeded. A pause. Measured and exact. His son asked me for nothing. He came to tell me that he thought I should know the full account of what had happened, in case it was useful to me in managing the estate going forward. He was extraordinarily civil about it. Eleanor thought of the bundle marked "These are not to be refiled." She thought of the register on the wall of the North Corridor, and the 20 years of meticulous documentation. And the way his voice had gone quiet and strange when the young man came to plead that "So you built a record." She said that I built a system, he said, in which no one working within this estate could ever say they did not know the cost of breaking a promise. Where no one could do what my father did and call it business and move on. He looked up. I thought if the system was rigorous enough, if every agreement was documented, every obligation tracked, every breach recorded and made public, then the thing my father did could not be done here. Not while I was here. That he stopped. Eleanor looked at him across the lamplit table. At this man who had spent 20 years building a fortress out of contract law and documentation and a public register of failures. And she thought about what it cost to build a thing like that. What it cost to maintain it. What it meant that he had never told anyone why. "You said your father told you that you would understand when you were older," she said. "Yes, did you?" "No," he said, with a flatness that was its own kind of answer. "I understood the mechanics. I never understood the absence of difficulty." The way he looked at those numbers. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "You chose me," she said, "because I was Barlow." That he looked at her, "Not in kind," she said, "but in position. Someone made a promise to me and broke it when a better option appeared, and I lost something I couldn't recover. And no one in authority found this worth noting." She kept her voice even. "You knew that story. And you thought if there is anyone who will not do to someone else what was done to her, it is someone who has been Barlow." He was very still. "That's not wrong," she said. "But I think you also needed to believe it was possible for a person to come through that and not become something diminished." She held his gaze. "You needed a proof that it could be survived without becoming your father. Without deciding that the only way to live in a world where promises are broken is to break them first, or to feel nothing when they break." The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. The moor outside was black and soundless. That he did not answer immediately. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Open. In the way that things are open when they have been closed for a very long time and the mechanism has finally, with considerable effort, been found." "She did not tell you you were forgiven," he said, quietly, as though testing the sentence to see if it held. "My mother. When I told her what I knew about Barlow. She did not say my father had done something forgivable. No. Eleanor said. "I imagine she didn't." She said it was done. "She said that what mattered now was what I did with what I knew." "That seems right," Eleanor said. That he picked up his glass from the window ledge and looked at it. Then he set it back down without drinking. "You are the first person," he said, "to whom I have told the full account." Eleanor looked at the papers on the table. Then at him. "That I know," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of something that had been in a sealed room for a long time, and a window had been opened, and the air was beginning slowly to change. I and the weeks that followed the night in the records room. Nothing was said about what had been said. This was not avoidance. Eleanor had lived long enough in silences of various kinds to know the difference between a silence that was suppressing something and a silence that was allowing something to settle. The night in the records room had been the kind of conversation that required no follow-up because it had been complete in itself, a thing said, received, and placed somewhere permanent. It did not need to be referenced to remain present. What changed was smaller than words and more durable. The Duke began, for instance, to remain in the records room in the evenings rather than retreating immediately to his study. He brought his own work correspondence, estate reviews, the quarterly reports from his solicitor in York and sat at the desk in the far corner while Eleanor sat at the central table. And they worked in the same room without speaking, and neither of them found this remarkable enough to comment on. It was simply what happened now that he began, also, to consult her, not in the formal way he had consulted her about the contract renewals that had been a delegation of a task. Clean and purposeful. This was different. He would set a document on the table near her without asking, and she would read it and make notes in the margin, and he would collect it later and she would find, the following morning, that her notes had been incorporated into the revised draft. Once she pushed back on a penalty clause she thought was disproportionate to the underlying breach, and he said, without looking up from his own papers, the clause has been in the standard contract for 11 years that I know. She said. I indexed them. A pause. And I think 11 years of proportionate results and 2 cases where it produced an outcome you then felt obliged to quietly mitigate suggests the clause is set at the wrong level. He was quiet for a moment. Which 2 cases? She named them. She had them memorized because she had spent 3 days cross-referencing the dispute records, and she had a memory for patterns in documents the way some people had a memory for faces. He looked at the draft in his hands. Then he took his pen and crossed out the penalty clause with a single clean line, write me a replacement. He said, she wrote it the following morning. He used it without alteration. After that, he began asking directly, which was different from consulting and also from delegating. He would appear in the doorway of whatever room she was working in and say, in his particular manner that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, the Fenwick renewal. The delivery schedule. And she would tell him what she thought, and he would listen in the way he listened, which was completely, and then he would either say yes or not that and explain why not. And she found that she respected the explanations and that she was learning from them, and she thought, from the way he framed his questions, that he was learning from her answers. One morning in late December she was reviewing the annual accounts when she found a discrepancy, a small one, easily missed, in the coal supply invoices from the previous winter. She brought it to the Duke's study, which she had not entered before without being summoned, and knocked at the open door. He was at his desk. He looked up, the coal invoices for last February. She said. The delivered quantity in the supplier's record is 14 tons. The quantity recorded by the estate on the date of delivery is 12. The difference has been paid but not noted. He held out his hand for the papers. She gave them to him and he reviewed them in silence. And she watched his face and saw not the rigid, closed control she had first encountered but something that was beginning to be familiar, the focused, internal quality of a man thinking, this supplier has been with the estate for 8 years. He said that I know. It may be a recording error. It may not be. She paused. I thought you should see it before I did anything further. He looked at her. What would you do further? Write to the estate accountant in York and ask him to review the supplier's records for the past 3 years. Quietly. So that if it is an error we have not damaged a relationship unnecessarily. She paused. And if it is not an error, then we have the documentation. He set the papers down. Do that. He said. She turned to go. Eleanor. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address, without the title, without anything around it. Just her name, plain and direct. In the same register he used for everything that mattered to him. She turned back. He was looking at her with an expression that was not readable in the way most of his expressions were not readable, but that had, underneath its surface, something that felt like she searched for the right word. And found it was not a single word but a combination, attention, and intention, and the specific quality of a man who has decided something and is still in the process of deciding it. Thank you. He said that it was 2 words. They were not 2 extraordinary words. But something in the way he said them with the same weight he gave to everything he chose to say. Without the automatic courtesy that usually accompanied such phrases made them mean something different from their ordinary meaning. Of course, she said, and left. She walked back to the records room and stood at the table for a moment without picking anything up. She realized, no longer pretending to herself that this was simply a good professional arrangement. She had been pretending it for several weeks, because pretending it was safer and because she had become, over the past 2 years, very good at removing herself from situations that might result in further damage. She was practical. She was clear-eyed. She did not build expectations on uncertain ground, but he had used her name, and she had felt it. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge what that meant. She picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. It was Mrs. Peel who told her, 3 days before Christmas, that a carriage had been sighted on the North Road. Eleanor was in the still room reviewing the household inventory when the housekeeper appeared with the slightly compressed expression of someone delivering information they consider to be of doubtful benefit. A carriage from the south. Your Grace. Mr. Alderton believes it is Mrs. Aldworth's vehicle. Eleanor set down the inventory ledger. Aunt Marjorie arrived 40 minutes later, accompanied by Eleanor's cousin Dorothea, who was 23, recently and advantageously married, and possessed of the particular confidence of a young woman who has successfully completed the primary objective that her upbringing had prepared her for. She entered the great hall with the wide-eyed appreciation of someone taking inventory, moved through the rooms with a thoroughness that was almost professional, and said, twice in Eleanor's hearing, that it was remarkable, really, how grand everything was. In a tone that managed to suggest this grandeur was somehow surprising given its current occupant. Aunt Marjorie was more direct. You look well, she said to Eleanor, with the slight surprise of someone who had not entirely expected this. They were in the drawing room, where tea had been laid, and the Duke had appeared briefly to greet the guests and had then been claimed by Mr. Alderton on a matter requiring his attention, a development Eleanor suspected was not entirely coincidental. That I am well, Eleanor said. The castle is. Marjorie looked around. It's very serious. Yes, are you? That is to say, is he? Marjorie arranged herself on the settee and looked at Eleanor with the expression she used when she wanted information but did not want to appear to want it. You seem different. More. I'm not sure. More settled. She paused. I had wondered, you know, whether it would suit you. Whether he would suit you. He is not an easy man. No, Eleanor agreed. He is not, but you manage him. Eleanor thought about this. I don't manage him, she said. We work together. Marjorie blinked. As though this distinction was unexpected, Dorothea arrived in the drawing room having completed her survey of the visible premises, and sat beside her mother with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had reached a verdict. Eleanor, she said, you must be very grateful. Eleanor poured tea. Of all the outcomes that might have been expected. Dorothea accepted her cup. No one could have predicted this. I do think the Duke must be a very unusual man, to have looked past. She stopped, apparently performing a belated calculation. That is, it must have been a very unconventional selection process. That I believe it was. Eleanor said that he chose you because he needed someone reliable, Dorothea said, with the helpful certainty of a woman who has arrived at an explanation she finds satisfying. That's what I told everyone, you know, when people asked. I said that the Duke was a practical man and he needed someone sensible to run his household, and Eleanor has always been sensible. If not. Another pause. Another calculation, slightly too late. Well, sensible. If not, Eleanor thought. If not what? She knew what. She had always known what. She was sensible if not young, if not beautiful, if not connected. If not the sort of woman whose choices were ever presumed to reflect her own judgment rather than the limited options available to her. Will you need Eleanor to show you to your rooms? Dorothea asked, with the bright helpfulness of a woman who has not noticed anything. You know how she is with houses. She's always been terribly good at the practical things. Mama, didn't we say on the way here that Eleanor would know exactly where everything was? Mrs. Peel will show you to your rooms, Eleanor said. She manages the household. I'll let her know you're ready. She rose and went to find Mrs. Peel. In the corridor outside the drawing room. She stopped for a moment, her hand on the wall, and breathed. 2 years ago she would have shown them to their rooms. She would have spent the next 3 days navigating the very particular cruelty of people who did not know they were being cruel. The continuous Low-grade diminishment of a woman who existed at the edges of other people's arrangements. She would have been useful and quiet and invisible, and she would have gone to bed each night with the steady dull ache of a person who had made a permanent accommodation with being overlooked. She was not going to do that. She was not entirely sure, even now, where the line was between the self she had been and the self she was becoming, but she could feel it, the way you feel a change in altitude. In the pressure of things, she found Mrs. Peel and gave the necessary instructions and returned to the drawing room and sat down and drank her tea and answered Dorothea's questions about the castle with the composed specific knowledge of a woman who had spent 2 months learning every room in it. The visit lasted 4 days. On the second day, Dorothea asked Eleanor to help locate a misplaced glove. On the third, Aunt Marjorie suggested, over breakfast, that Eleanor might want to review the kitchen menus because Cook has always listened to you, dear, and the soup last night was very salty. Eleanor said, pleasantly, that Mrs. Peel managed all household matters and would be glad to receive any concerns directly. On the fourth day, the Duke came to find her. She was in the records room. She was almost always in the records room, which Dorothea had described on the first day as terribly dull and had not subsequently entered. The Duke appeared in the doorway with the look of a man who has been in proximity to something difficult and has decided to address it from a different angle. He looked at her. She looked at him. Your cousin, he said, asked me at dinner last night whether you had always been so capable, in a tone that I found I did not particularly like. Eleanor set down her pen. What did you say? I said that capability was not a consolation prize. He looked at the shelves for a moment. I said it rather more directly than that. She felt something move in her chest, not the relief of being defended, which she had felt at Ashford Hall and which was its own distinct thing, but something quieter and more internal. The sense of being known accurately. Not defended as a reflex, but understood and defended as a consequence of that understanding. They will be leaving tomorrow, she said. Yes, he said that I don't need you to manage them on my behalf. She said. I want to be clear about that. I am capable of managing them myself. I know, he said. That is not why I said it. Why, then? He looked at her with those gray, undeflectable eyes. Because it was true, he said, as though this were the only relevant consideration. Which she was beginning to understand was, for him, exactly the case. And because I dislike inaccuracy, she looked at him for a moment. Then she said, sit down. I want to show you something in the Fenwick renewal. There's a delivery schedule clause I think we should revisit before it goes out. He sat down. She pushed the contract across the table. They bent over it together in the lamplight, their heads a foot apart. And the visit and Dorothea and Aunt Marjorie and all the machinery of other people's opinions settled into the background where it belonged. Outside, the December wind moved across the moors and the castle stood in it, solid and dark and indifferent to the cold. As it had stood for 300 years, the letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Aunt Marjorie and Dorothea had departed. It was not from Aunt Marjorie. The handwriting on the envelope was different, more deliberate. With the slight overemphasis of a man who had learned to write in a formal setting and had never entirely relaxed out of it. She knew it before she opened it because she had seen it on documents. On a lease agreement. On the correspondence her father had kept in the left-hand drawer of his desk. Tied with a cord, which she had found and read and then replaced exactly as she had found it, the way she had replaced the bundle in the records room. Because some things deserved to remain where they had been placed even when you now knew what they contained. Charles Welford had written to the Duke. She found this out because the Duke came to the records room that evening and set the letter on the table in front of her without speaking. She read it. It was carefully composed. It acknowledged the exchange at Ashford Hall with a tone of injured dignity that managed to imply the Duke had been the aggressor. It expressed, in formal and elaborate terms, certain concerns about Eleanor's character that Welford described as having come to his attention and that he felt, as a man of conscience, obligated to share. The concerns were specific. They were also entirely fabricated. She recognized the shape of them. The same shape that rumors took when they were constructed to fit a particular conclusion rather than emerging from actual events. He claimed she had been dishonest with him during their engagement, that her family had misrepresented her circumstances. That his withdrawal had been an act of self-protection rather than inconstancy. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript that had the feeling of an afterthought designed to appear as one while being the actual point, he noted that he understood the Duke valued accurate record-keeping, and that he had felt it his duty to ensure the Duke possessed an accurate record in this matter. Eleanor set the letter down. The Duke was standing at the window. He had not sat. He was looking out at the winter garden, which was bare and frost-whitened. The shapes of the dormant plants visible as outlines against the pale ground. "You've read it," she said. "Yes," and Duddy turned from the window. He looked at her with the same grey, direct attention he had brought to every document he had ever placed in front of her. To every question he had ever asked her, to the bundle of old correspondence in the third shelf of the records room that he had untied and read aloud in the lamplight 3 weeks ago. "That I want to know," he said, "what you want to say about it." "Nothing." She said. That he waited. "That is not the same as having nothing to say." She said. "I have a great deal to say about it. None of what he has written is accurate, and I could demonstrate that with documentation if you required it." She looked at the letter. "But I told you when we first met that I had stopped explaining myself. I told you that I had done it repeatedly and it had produced nothing except more elaborate versions of the same story." She paused. "I am not going to explain myself to you. If you believe it, then the premise on which you selected me, that I was a person who had never misrepresented anything, is false. And one of us has made a significant error. You can determine which." The room was quiet. The Duke crossed to the fireplace. He picked up the letter from the table as he passed it, and he held it over the fire. And he let it go. The paper caught and blackened and was gone in less than a minute. That he looked at the fire for a moment. Then he turned back to her. "The Fenwick contract," he said. "You mentioned last week that you wanted to look at the arbitration clause." "Yes." She said. "Show me." She found the contract and set it on the table, and they sat down on opposite sides, and she showed him the clause. The first snow came on a Friday in January, arriving overnight and covering the moors by morning in a white so complete it erased the distinction between land and sky. Eleanor stood at her east-facing window before breakfast and looked at it for a long time. The heather was invisible under it. The stone walls between the fields were visible only as slightly darker lines, the seams of an older landscape showing through the new one. That she had been at Cresthollow for 3 months. She thought about the linen room at Aunt Marjorie's house, which also had an east-facing window. She thought about the 17 unsalvageable tablecloths and the precise, efficient sorrow of folding things that could not be repaired. She thought about what she had believed on that morning, which was that the shape of her life had been determined by an event she had not caused and could not appeal. And that what remained was to find the smallest and most manageable version of it and live inside that. She had been wrong. She had been wrong not in the way of someone who had made an error in reasoning, but in the way of someone who had drawn an accurate conclusion from insufficient evidence. The evidence had changed. She dressed and went downstairs. The Duke was already in the records room. This was not unusual. He was often there before her now, working in the early morning before the household's day began. And she had stopped being surprised to find the lamp already lit and a second cup on the tray that appeared each morning at 7:30. She did not know when this had started. She had noticed it one morning approximately 3 weeks ago and had not commented on it. Because there was nothing to comment on that would not make it into something different from what it was. He looked up when she came in. "Snow," she said. "0.3 inches, approximately," he said. "The north road will be impassable by mid-morning. We are here for several days that I know," she said. She poured her tea. She sat down across from him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the document case at his left and removed a folded piece of paper and placed it on the table between them. It was not a contract, she could see that immediately. Because it was not the weight or format of a contract, and it was not sealed, and he had placed it in the middle of the table rather than at her side or his side, which was where documents with a designated reader were always placed. He had placed it between them. Equidistant, she looked at it. Then at him. "Read it," he said. She unfolded it. It was the marriage contract. Their marriage contract, the original document. With its formal enumeration of her entitlements and his obligations and the terms of the arrangement they had entered into on a frost-silvered morning in November. She had read it once before, when his solicitor had presented it. And she had read it with the attention she brought to all documents and had found it, as he had promised, more than fair. She read it now and saw immediately what was different. The clauses were intact, the financial provisions, the property settlements, the formal language of the agreement. But through 3 passages, in the Duke's compressed, exact hand, lines had been drawn. Not corrections, not emendations. Deliberate, single, final lines through specific phrases, through, in fulfillment of the duties of the position, through, as required by the terms herein, through, in accordance with her obligations as set forth above. In the margin beside each crossed-out phrase, in the same hand, were 4 words, written once and not repeated because once was enough. Because he was a man who did not repeat himself when he had said a thing correctly, because I choose to. Eleanor read it twice. She read the crossed-out phrases and the 4 words in the margin and the signature at the bottom that was just his name, no title, no flourish. The same way he had signed his first letter to her. She understood what he had done, that he had taken the document that defined their arrangement, the document that made her presence here a matter of contract and obligation and mutual terms, and he had crossed out every phrase that reduced her actions to compliance. Every clause that said, she does these things because she agreed to. He had replaced them with the only alternative, she does these things, and I do these things. Because we have chosen to, for a man who had built 20 years of his life on the principle that agreements were the only reliable foundation for anything. This was not a small revision. This was the most significant thing he knew how to do. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know as his version of openness, not soft, not demonstrative, but fully present. Entirely without the controlled distance he maintained with the rest of the world. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was standing in it. That I made a practical arrangement. He said. I told you that when I came to your aunt's house. I told you I required a duchess with specific qualities and that you met those requirements. I told you it would not be romantic. That I did not offer sentiment or pretense. He paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man ensuring that what he said next was accurate. I was correct about the arrangement. I was not correct about what the arrangement would become. Eleanor set the contract down carefully. Parallel to the edge of the table, you crossed out the obligation clauses. She said, yes, that is a legally significant alteration that I know. He said. I drew it up with my solicitor. The revised version is properly executed. This is your copy. She looked at him. You had your solicitor redraft the marriage contract to remove the language of obligation that I had him redraft it to reflect the accurate situation. He said. Which is that you have, since arriving here, done nothing I asked because you were required to. You reorganized the records because they needed organizing. You reviewed the contracts because you wanted to understand the estate. You told me things I needed to hear in a way I could receive them. None of that was in the agreement. He looked at T. He contract between them. I don't want a document that says you are here because you agreed to be. I want a document that says what is true. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and continuous, covering the moors in silence, when I left my aunt's house. She said, I had decided that what I needed was a place where I would be taken seriously. That was the whole of it. I had stopped asking for anything beyond that. She looked at the contract. Then at him. I didn't expect to find. She stopped. What? He said. Not pressing. Waiting, someone who uses the same language I do. She said. Someone for whom the most serious thing you can do for a person is to get the record right. Something in his face changed in the way that very controlled things change when the control is no longer performing a function, not a collapse, but a settling. A coming to rest. That I have not been good at this, he said. At any of the things this requires. At being known. At allowing it. That I know, she said. That I find I want to be. He said. Better at it. Eleanor looked at the 4 words in the margin of the contract. Because I choose to. For words written in the margin of a legal document by a man who expressed everything that mattered to him in the language of records and agreements and careful, indelible ink that I accept the revised terms, she said. The corner of his mouth moved that it was not quite a smile. But it was the thing that lived next door to one, the expression of a man who has found, after a long search conducted in the wrong places, something that was there all along, the arbitration clause, he said. You had a proposal that I did, she said. She picked up her pen. He pulled the Fenwick contract toward him. Outside the records room, the castle settled around them. Its 300 years of stone indifferent to the weather and the cold, as it had always been, as it would continue to be, and inside it, in the room where every promise the estate had ever made was recorded and kept, two people bent over a contract together in the winter light, choosing, without obligation, to be exactly where they were. 1 year later, the north corridor wall of Cresthollow Castle held two documents. The first was the register of broken agreements, maintained, updated, the record of 20 years' worth of failures and their consequences. Still there because honesty required that the failures be acknowledged alongside everything else. Beside it, newly framed, was a second document, a record of agreements fulfilled, organized by year and by party, running to 3 full pages. The handwriting was Eleanor's. The entries were specific and detailed, in the way that everything in this house was specific and detailed, not agreement kept but the particular agreement, the particular parties, the particular terms, the particular date on which delivery was confirmed and payment made, and both parties departed satisfied. The fulfilled record was longer than the breach register. Not by a little. Aunt Marjorie wrote in March with an inquiry about whether she might visit in the summer, her tone carrying the careful warmth of a woman who has reassessed a situation and is approaching it from a new angle. Eleanor wrote back and said yes, the second week of July would suit them well, and that she should bring Dorothea if she liked on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The Duke came to find Eleanor in the records room and stood in the doorway and said, in his particular manner, the surveyor's report on the East Field drainage. He's given us 3 options. I've read it, Eleanor said. I think the second option, but the timeline needs adjusting. Show me. He said that he came in. He sat down. She pushed the report across the table. The window behind her faced east, and the spring light came through it across the moorland, and the heather was beginning to come up through the ground in the small, determined way that heather did, year after year. Through everything, and the room smelled of paper and ink and the faint cold air of the north, and the record on the wall was longer than it had been the day before, because she had added an entry that morning, and would add another tomorrow, and another after that. For as long as there were promises worth keeping and someone to write them down.